What if I told you that a mysterious nation prophesied to vanish from the earth actually disappeared exactly as foretold? Long before their destruction was written in sacred texts, the Philistines were the ancient world's most feared warriors, sea peoples who conquered coastlines, monopolized iron weapons, and stood as the greatest threat to God's chosen nation. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zephaniah all pronounced the same chilling verdict: total annihilation. "I will destroy you until no inhabitant remains," declared the Lord. And against all odds, it happened. An entire civilization erased. But their story holds secrets that will leave you stunned. These weren't primitive tribes. They were advanced seafarers from distant lands who built an empire of 5 mighty cities, possessed technology Israel couldn't match, and nearly crushed God's plan for his people. Yet today, not a single person on earth can claim Philistine blood. How did ancient prophecies come true with such precision? Where did these mysterious invaders originate? And why does their name haunt the very land where they once ruled? The truth is more extraordinary than you can imagine. The Philistines didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were part of something much bigger, a massive wave of people moving across the ancient world around 1200 BC. History calls them the Sea Peoples, and they were changing everything in their path. These weren't wandering nomads. They were organized warriors and families sailing across the Mediterranean Sea, looking for new lands to call home. They came from islands and coastlands far to the north and west, places we now know as Greece, Crete, and Cyprus. Something had happened in their homelands, something that forced them to leave and seek new territory. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses III faced these sea peoples in battle. His scribes carved records into temple walls describing how these foreign invaders attacked Egypt's borders again and again. The Egyptians called them by different names, and among those names was one that would echo through history: the Peliset. This was the Egyptian word for the people who would become known as the Philistines. Egypt was strong enough to push them back. The Sea Peoples couldn't conquer the land of the pharaohs, but they needed somewhere to settle. So they turned their attention to the coastland of Canaan, a fertile strip of land along the Mediterranean Sea. This would become their new home, and from this base they would challenge God's people for centuries to come. After being turned away from Egypt, the Philistines found exactly what they were looking for along Canaan's coast. The land was rich and green, perfect for growing crops and raising livestock. Even better, it sat right on the major trade routes connecting Egypt to the north. They didn't trickle in slowly. The Philistines came as a coordinated group and took control of specific areas. They chose the coastal plain, that flat stretch of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the hill country where the Israelites would later settle. This wasn't an accident. They picked the best agricultural land and the most strategic location for trade. The region they claimed stretched about 50 miles along the coast. It was called Philistia, named after the people who now controlled it. From here, they could see ships coming and going, control who traveled the coastal highway, and grow wealthy from the land's abundance. The sea was in their blood. Unlike the Israelites, who were shepherds and farmers of the hills, the Philistines understood maritime trade and coastal living. They knew how to build ports, navigate ships, and connect with trading partners across the Mediterranean world. This coastal plain became their stronghold. The Philistines built their cities here, established their culture, and created a civilization that would stand for hundreds of years. They weren't planning to leave, they were planning to dominate. The Philistines organized themselves in a unique way. Instead of having one king over all their territory, they built 5 major cities, each functioning as its own independent power center. These 5 cities were Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each city had its own ruler, called a Syrian in their language. This word appears in the Bible and is unique to the Philistines. No other people used this exact term for their leaders. When the book of Joshua mentions the Philistine lords in chapter 13, verse 3, it lists them. The 5 lords of the Philistines, those of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. These 5 Syrenes didn't compete with each other for ultimate control. Instead, they worked together when necessary, forming a kind of alliance or confederacy. When big decisions needed to be made, or when war threatened all of them, the 5 lords would meet and decide together. Gaza sat at the southern end of their territory, closest to Egypt. It controlled the main road between Egypt and the rest of Canaan. Ashkelon and Ashdod were major port cities on the Mediterranean coast, bringing in wealth from sea trade. Ekron sat inland, protecting the eastern frontier. And Gath, perhaps the most famous of all, was home to giants, including one named Goliath, who would later face a shepherd boy named David. Each city was heavily fortified with thick walls and strong gates. Inside, thousands of people lived, worked, and worshipped. These weren't small villages. They were genuine urban centers with organized streets, public buildings, and all the infrastructure of advanced civilization. The 5-city system made the Philistines flexible and resilient. If one city fell, the others could continue. If one lord was weak, the others could compensate. This political structure would help them maintain power for generations, making them one of the most formidable enemies Israel would ever face. The Philistines never forgot where they came from. Even after settling in Canaan, they maintained customs and practices that clearly showed their foreign origins. They were different from everyone around them, and they wanted to stay that way. Their pottery told the story of their homeland. When archaeologists dig up Philistine sites today, they find distinctive ceramics, decorated with patterns and designs that look nothing like local Canaanite pottery. Instead, these designs match pottery styles from the Aegean world, the islands and coastlands of Greece and Crete. The Philistines painted birds, geometric patterns, and spirals on their vessels, just like their ancestors had done across the sea. Even their houses were built differently. While Canaanites and Israelites built homes in certain traditional ways, the Philistines constructed buildings with features common in the Aegean. They used central hearths for cooking and heating, a practice virtually unknown in Canaan but standard in their original homeland. The prophet Amos understood their origins. In chapter 9, verse 7, God speaks through him, asking, "Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir?" Caphtor is believed to be Crete, or the greater Aegean region. The Bible itself confirms that the Philistines were immigrants from distant lands. Their diet was different too. The Philistines ate pork, something that separated them from both the Israelites and most other Semitic peoples in Canaan. Archaeological digs consistently find pig bones in Philistine sites, but rarely in Israelite settlements. This wasn't just about food preferences, it was about identity and maintaining their distinct culture. The Philistines worshipped their own gods. Dagon was their chief deity, often depicted as half man and half fish. They also honored Baal-zebub and Ashtoreth, blending some local Canaanite religious elements with their own traditions. Their temples were architectural statements, large buildings that dominated city centers and demonstrated their devotion to their gods. Everything about the Philistines declared that they were foreigners who had claimed this land as their own. They didn't become Canaanites. They remained Philistines, proud of their heritage and determined to maintain their unique identity in this new world. What made the Philistines truly dangerous wasn't just their numbers or their organization, it was their technology. They possessed something that gave them an overwhelming advantage over everyone around them, the secret of iron. In the ancient world, controlling metal technology meant controlling military power. The Philistines had mastered the art of working with iron, creating weapons and tools far superior to the bronze implements used by most other peoples in Canaan. Iron was harder, held a sharper edge, and didn't break as easily as bronze. But here's what made the situation even worse for Israel. The Philistines didn't share this technology. They kept it as a monopoly, a closely guarded secret that maintained their dominance. 1 Samuel chapter 13 reveals just how complete this control was. Verses 19 through 22 explain, "Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, 'Otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears.' So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. The price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes, and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them." Think about what this means. Israelite farmers had to travel to Philistine blacksmiths just to sharpen their farming tools. They had to pay the enemy for basic maintenance of their equipment. And when war came, the Israelite army faced Philistine iron weapons with almost nothing but farming tools and a few bronze weapons. The Philistines didn't just have better individual weapons, they had a professional military force. These weren't farmers who picked up weapons when needed. These were trained warriors who dedicated their lives to fighting. They understood tactics, formations, and the coordination needed for effective warfare. Their armies included chariots, which were the ancient equivalent of tanks. Chariots required flat terrain to be effective, which is exactly what the Philistine coastal plain provided. When they could draw Israeli forces down from the hills onto flat ground, the Philistines' chariot advantage became devastating. They also employed champions, individual warriors of extraordinary size and skill, who would challenge enemy armies in single combat. These weren't myths or exaggerations. Archaeological evidence confirms that some Philistine warriors were indeed exceptionally tall, possibly descended from groups the Bible calls the Anakim or Rephaim. This military superiority allowed the Philistines to project power far beyond their 5 cities. They could raid Israelite territory almost at will, demand tribute, and enforce their dominance through the constant threat of their iron-equipped armies. For the early Israelites, facing Philistine forces must have felt like fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. Military might was only part of the Philistine success story. These people were also incredibly wealthy, and their wealth came from being in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The coastal location they'd chosen gave them control over multiple streams of income. Their ports on the Mediterranean Sea connected them to a vast trading network that stretched from Egypt to Cyprus to the Aegean homeland they'd left behind. Ships arrived regularly, bringing goods from distant lands and leaving with products from Canaan. The Philistines became middlemen in international trade. Egyptian grain and papyrus passed through their ports heading north. Timber from Lebanon, pottery from Cyprus, and metals from various sources all changed hands in Philistine markets. Every transaction meant taxes, fees, and profit for the Philistine cities. Their agricultural land was some of the most productive in the region. The coastal plain received good rainfall and had rich soil. The Philistines grew wheat and barley in abundance. Their olive groves produced oil that was highly valued throughout the ancient world. Vineyards covered their hillsides, producing wine that became a major export. But they didn't just export raw materials. The Philistines developed manufacturing industries. Their pottery workshops produced distinctive ceramics that archaeologists find scattered across the ancient Near East, proof of extensive trade relationships. They wove textiles, processed foods, and created various goods that commanded premium prices in regional markets. The Philistines also controlled the land routes. The major coastal highway that connected Egypt to Mesopotamia ran right through their territory. Any merchants, armies, or travelers moving between these great civilizations had to pass through Philistine lands and pay for the privilege. This economic strength reinforced their military power. Wealth meant they could maintain professional armies, build and repair strong fortifications, and purchase the best weapons and equipment. It meant they could hire mercenaries if needed and sustain long military campaigns without bankrupting their cities. The five-city system worked brilliantly for economic purposes too. Each city specialized in different aspects of trade and production while sharing in the overall prosperity. If one city's crops failed, the others could support it. If one port faced problems, ships could redirect to another. This wasn't a subsistence economy where people just grew enough to survive. This was sophisticated capitalism, trade, manufacturing, specialization, and the accumulation of wealth on a scale that few ancient peoples achieved. The Philistines understood that economic power and military power reinforced each other, creating a cycle of dominance that would last for centuries. When the Philistines first arrived in Canaan, they brought their own language with them, something completely different from the Semitic languages spoken by Canaanites, Israelites, and other peoples of the region. Their original tongue likely belonged to the Indo-European language family, related to early Greek and other Aegean languages. But language is a living thing that changes over time, especially when different peoples live close together. The Philistines found themselves surrounded by Semitic-speaking populations. For trade, diplomacy, and daily interactions with their neighbors, they needed to communicate. Gradually, over generations, they adopted the local languages while probably keeping some of their original words for special purposes. The unique word seren for their rulers is one example of their original language surviving. It appears in the Hebrew Bible but isn't a Hebrew word. It's Philistine, a remnant of their linguistic heritage that the biblical writers preserved because there was no exact Hebrew equivalent. The Philistines could read and write. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered inscriptions in their cities, showing they used various writing systems. They adapted the local alphabetic scripts that were being developed in Canaan, using them for administrative records, religious texts, and other purposes. One particularly significant find is an inscription from Ekron that mentions their deity Baal-zebub and names some of their rulers. This inscription shows that by the later period of Philistine civilization, they were writing in a Semitic language, though they still maintained their distinct identity and religious practices. The blending of languages reveals something important about the Philistines. They were practical people. They maintained their cultural identity and pride in their origins, but they weren't so rigid that they couldn't adapt when necessary. Learning the local languages helped them succeed in trade, negotiate with neighbors, and integrate into the regional political landscape, all while remaining distinctly Philistine in their culture and loyalties. Inside the walls of Philistine cities, life was organized and orderly. Society had clear levels, with everyone knowing their place and role. At the top sat the Syrenes and their courts, the ruling class who made decisions, commanded armies, and controlled the wealth. These lords lived in large residences, ate the finest foods, and enjoyed luxuries imported from across the Mediterranean world. Archaeological excavations of palace complexes show sophisticated architecture with multiple rooms, courtyards, and evidence of elaborate feasting. Below the ruling class came the military elites, professional warriors who formed the backbone of Philistine power. These men trained constantly, maintained the best equipment, and received special privileges in return for their service. Some were champions of exceptional size and skill, held in high honor by their society. Merchants and craftsmen formed a prosperous middle class. Blacksmiths held especially high status because of the valuable knowledge they possessed about working with iron. Potters, weavers, and other skilled workers also enjoyed respect and reasonable prosperity. These were the people who made the Philistine economy function. Farmers worked the fertile lands around the cities, growing the grain, olives, and grapes that fed the population and generated export wealth. While they ranked lower in social status than urban craftsmen, They were free people with rights and protections under Philistine law. Philistine cities were well planned, not the chaotic jumbles that some ancient settlements became. Streets were laid out in organized patterns. Houses were built with attention to sanitation, including drainage systems that carried waste away from living areas. The Philistines understood urban planning in ways that made their cities healthier and more pleasant to live in than many contemporary settlements. Their homes were typically larger and more substantial than those of neighboring peoples. A typical Philistine house might have several rooms arranged around a central courtyard, with the hearth as a focal point. Families lived, cooked, and gathered in these spaces, maintaining traditions that connected them to their Aegean ancestors. Women in Philistine society appear to have had more social presence than in some neighboring cultures. Female figurines found in archaeological sites and evidence from burial practices suggest that women held significant roles in both family and religious life. While Philistine society was certainly patriarchal like all ancient cultures, women weren't invisible or powerless. Feasting held special importance in Philistine culture. Large halls designed specifically for communal eating and drinking have been discovered in their cities. These weren't just dining rooms, they were spaces for celebrating victories, honoring warriors, conducting rituals, and reinforcing social bonds. The Philistines celebrated life, success, and their own strength through these shared meals. Daily life for most Philistines meant work, family, and participation in the community's religious and social activities. Children grew up learning the trades of their parents. Young men trained for military service or apprenticed in crafts. The rhythm of the seasons governed agricultural work, while the rhythm of trade governed life in the ports. The Philistines had created something impressive, a transplanted civilization that maintained its distinct character while adapting to new circumstances. Their cities were prosperous, their society organized, and their culture vibrant. They had every reason to believe their dominance would continue indefinitely. They couldn't know that a small group of shepherd people living in the nearby hills would eventually challenge everything they'd built. The Israelites and Philistines were destined to collide. It wasn't a matter of if, but when. The Philistines controlled the rich coastal plain, while the Israelite tribes settled in the hill country just inland. Between them lay a region called the Shephelah, rolling lowlands that both peoples wanted. During the time of the Judges, these tensions began to heat up. The book of Judges records in chapter 10, verse 7, that the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he sold them into the hands of the Philistines. This wasn't a single battle or a short conflict. The Philistines began a systematic campaign to dominate their neighbors. Chapter 13, verse 1 makes the situation clear. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. 40 years. That's nearly 2 generations of people living under Philistine pressure and control. The Philistines didn't need to conquer all of Israel to dominate them. They used their superior military technology and organization to conduct raids, demand tribute, and slowly expand their influence eastward into Israelite territory. Small border towns lived in constant fear. Farmers worked their fields knowing Philistine warriors could appear at any moment. The Israelites were fragmented during this period, organized as separate tribes without central leadership. Each tribe handled its own affairs, which made them vulnerable to a coordinated enemy like the Philistines. When one Israelite town was attacked, others might not come to help. The Philistines exploited this disunity ruthlessly. These weren't grand battles with massive armies. Most encounters were raids, skirmishes over disputed territory, and the slow, grinding pressure of a stronger power against a weaker one. The Philistines were testing boundaries, pushing further inland, establishing their dominance piece by piece. Into this situation of oppression came a man unlike any other, Samson. His birth was announced by an angel to his barren mother, as recorded in Judges chapter 13. The angel told her in verse 5, "You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Samson grew up with supernatural strength, but his approach to fighting the Philistines was unusual. He didn't lead armies or plan military campaigns. Instead, he waged what could only be called a personal vendetta. His conflict with the Philistines began over a woman. Samson went down to Timnah, a Philistine town, and saw a woman he wanted to marry. His parents objected, as chapter 14 verse 3 shows, asking, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But verse 4 reveals something his parents didn't understand. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. On the way to visit this woman, a young lion attacked Samson. Chapter 14 verse 6 describes what happened. "The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done." At the wedding feast, Samson posed a riddle to 30 Philistine companions. When they couldn't solve it, they threatened his bride, forcing her to get the answer from Samson. He realized the betrayal and responded in verse 19, "Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. The Philistines gave Samson's bride to another man. When Samson discovered this, his revenge was creative and devastating." Chapter 15 verses 4 and 5 explain, "So he went out and caught 300 foxes and tied them tail to tail in pairs. He then fastened a torch to every pair of tails, lit the torches, and let the foxes loose in the standing grain of the Philistines. He burned up the shocks and standing grain, together with the vineyards and olive groves." The Philistines retaliated by burning Samson's wife and her father to death. Samson's response in verse 8 was fierce. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. The Philistines came in force to capture Samson. The men of Judah, living under Philistine control and afraid of reprisals, bound Samson and handed him over. But chapter 15 verse 14 records what happened next. As he approached Lehi, the Philistines came toward him shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. The ropes on his arms became like charred flax, and the bindings dropped from his hands. Verse 15 continues, "Finding a fresh jawbone of a donkey, he grabbed it and struck down 1,000 men." After this incredible feat, Samson composed a victory song, recorded in verse 16, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." Later, Samson went to Gaza, another Philistine city. When the Philistines heard he was there, they planned to kill him in the morning. Chapter 16 verse 3 shows Samson's contempt for their plans. But Samson lay there only until the middle of the night. He got up and took hold of the doors of the city gate, together with the 2 posts, and tore them loose, bar and all. He lifted them to his shoulders and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Then came Delilah. The Philistine rulers approached her with an offer, as recorded in chapter 16 verse 5. "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength, and how we can overpower him, so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." Delilah repeatedly asked Samson for the source of his strength, and he repeatedly lied to her. Finally, worn down by her persistent nagging, Samson told her the truth in verse 17. "No razor has ever been used on my head, because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." While Samson slept, Delilah had someone shave his head. Verse 19 explains, having put him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Verse 20 contains one of the saddest statements in Scripture. Then she called, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep and thought, I'll go out as before and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. The Philistines captured Samson and treated him with brutal cruelty. Verse 21 records, Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But verse 22 mentions a detail the Philistines overlooked. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. The Philistine rulers gathered for a great festival to sacrifice to their god Dagon, celebrating Samson's capture. Verses 23 and 24 describe the scene. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon their god, and to celebrate, saying, Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain. They brought Samson out to entertain them. Verse 25 says, While they were in high spirits, they shouted, Bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them, when they stood him among the pillars. Samson asked the servant leading him to let him feel the pillars supporting the temple. Then he prayed. Verse 28 records his final words to God, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Verses 29 and 30 describe Samson's last act. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, Let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. The conflict between Israel and the Philistines reached a new level during the time of Eli the priest. 1 Samuel chapter 4 opens with Israel and the Philistines preparing for battle near a place called Aphek. The first engagement went badly for Israel. Verse 2 records, The Philistines deployed their forces to meet Israel, and as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 of them on the battlefield. The Israelite elders made a fateful decision. Verse 3 explains their reasoning. When the soldiers returned to camp, the elders of Israel asked, Why did the Lord bring defeat on us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that he may go with us and save us from the hand of our enemies. They treated the ark like a good luck charm, thinking its physical presence would guarantee victory. Verse 4 continues, So the people sent men to Shiloh, and they brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. When the ark arrived in the Israelite camp, the people shouted so loudly that the ground shook. The Philistines heard the noise and became afraid. Verses 7 and 8 reveal their terror. The Philistines were afraid. A god has come into the camp, they said. Oh no, nothing like this has happened before. We're doomed. Who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? They are the gods who struck the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. But then the Philistine commanders rallied their troops with words recorded in verse 9. Be strong, Philistines, be men, or you will be subject to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight. The battle that followed was catastrophic for Israel. Verse 10 describes the defeat. So the Philistines fought, and the Israelites were defeated, and every man fled to his tent. The slaughter was very great. Israel lost 30,000 foot soldiers. Verse 11 adds the devastating detail. The ark of God was captured, and Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, died. When news reached Eli that the ark had been captured, the shock killed him. But the story was far from over. The Philistines took the ark to Ashdod and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon, as recorded in chapter 5, verse 2. The next morning brought a surprise. Verse 3 explains, "When the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. They took Dagon and put him back in his place." The following morning was worse. Verse 4 continues, "But the following morning when they rose, there was Dagon, fallen on his face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. His head and hands had been broken off and were lying on the threshold. Only his body remained." Then plague struck the city. Verse 6 records, "The Lord's hand was heavy on the people of Ashdod and its vicinity. He brought devastation on them and afflicted them with tumors." The people of Ashdod sent the ark to Gath, but verse 9 shows what happened there. "But after they had moved it, the Lord's hand was against that city, throwing it into a great panic. He afflicted the people of the city, both young and old, with an outbreak of tumors. They sent it to Ekron, but the people there refused to keep it." Chapter 5, verse 12 summarizes the situation. "Those who did not die were afflicted with tumors, and the outcry of the city went up to heaven." After 7 months of suffering, the Philistine rulers consulted their priests and diviners. Chapter 6, verse 2 records their question, "What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we should send it back to its place." The answer came in verse 3. "If you return the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it back to him without a gift. By all means send a guilt offering to him. Then you will be healed, and you will know why his hand has not been lifted from you." Following their priest's instructions, the Philistines made a guilt offering of 5 gold tumors and 5 gold rats, 1 for each of their rulers. They placed the ark on a new cart pulled by 2 cows that had never been yoked, whose calves had been penned up. Verse 9 explains the test. "Watch the cart. If it goes up to its own territory, toward Beth Shemesh, then the Lord has brought this great disaster on us. But if it does not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us, but that it happened to us by chance." The cows went straight toward Beth Shemesh without turning. The Philistines followed until they saw the Israelites receive the ark back. The Philistine threat became the catalyst for one of the biggest changes in Israel's history, the demand for a king. The people came to Samuel and said in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 20, "Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." God chose Saul, a tall, impressive man from the tribe of Benjamin. Chapter 9, verse 16 records God's purpose for Saul. "About this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me." Saul's first major test came at a place called Michmash. The Philistines assembled a massive force. Chapter 13, verse 5 describes their army. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel, with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 charioteers, and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth Aven. The Israelites were terrified. Verse 6 continues, "When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard-pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns." Saul waited for Samuel to come and offer sacrifices, but when Samuel delayed, Saul took matters into his own hands and offered the sacrifice himself. Samuel arrived just as Saul finished and rebuked him severely. Verses 13 and 14 record Samuel's words, "You have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. Despite this rebuke, Saul's son Jonathan achieved a remarkable victory. Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2 set the scene. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Jonathan and his armor-bearer climbed up to the Philistine outpost. Verse 13 describes their attack. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. God caused panic in the Philistine camp. Verse 15 explains, "Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook." It was a panic sent by God. The Philistines began fighting each other in the confusion, and Israel won a great victory that day. But this wasn't the end of the conflict. Chapter 14, verse 52 summarizes Saul's entire reign. All the days of Saul, there was bitter war with the Philistines, and whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service. The war with the Philistines defined Saul's kingship. He spent his reign in constant military campaigns, trying to keep the Philistines from overrunning Israel. David's introduction to the national stage came through the most famous Philistine of all, Goliath. 1 Samuel chapter 17 sets the scene with the Philistines and Israelites facing each other across the valley of Elah. Verse 4 introduces the champion. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. That's over 9 feet tall. Verses 8 through 10 record Goliath's challenge. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other." For 40 days Goliath issued this challenge twice daily. The Israelite army was terrified. Then David, a young shepherd bringing supplies to his brothers, heard the challenge and volunteered to fight. King Saul tried to give David his armor, but verse 39 shows it didn't work. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around, because he was not used to them. "I cannot go in these," he said to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he took them off. Instead, David chose 5 smooth stones from a stream and approached Goliath with his shepherd's staff and sling. Goliath was insulted. Verses 43 and 44 record his contempt. "Am I a dog, that you come at me with sticks? Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David's response in verses 45 through 47 is one of the great declarations of faith in Scripture. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Verse 49 describes what happened next. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. David ran forward, took Goliath's own sword, and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. The Israelites pursued and won a great victory, but David's relationship with the Philistines didn't end there. When Saul became jealous and tried to kill David, the young warrior had to flee for his life. Surprisingly, David sought refuge in Philistine territory. Chapter 21 verse 10 states, "That day David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath." The servants of Achish recognized David as the one who had killed Goliath. David became afraid and pretended to be insane, as verse 13 describes. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. Later, David tried again to find safety among the Philistines. Chapter 27 verses 2 and 3 explain, "So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. Achish gave David the town of Ziklag. David lived in Philistine territory for over a year, raiding various peoples, but telling Achish he was attacking Israelite territories. Verse 12 shows that Achish believed David's deception. Achish trusted David and said to himself, "He has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life." When the Philistines gathered to fight Israel again, Achish wanted David to join them. Chapter 28 verse 2 records Achish's words, "Very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life." But the other Philistine commanders didn't trust David. Chapter 29 verses 4 and 5 show their objection. But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Achish reluctantly sent David away, which saved David from the impossible situation of fighting against his own people. While David was being sent away from the Philistine army, Saul faced the greatest crisis of his reign. The Philistines had assembled their full military strength for what they intended to be a final, decisive battle against Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 28 verse 4 describes the Philistine gathering. "The Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all Israel and set up camp at Gilboa. Saul was terrified." Verse 5 states, "When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. He tried to seek God's guidance, but verse 6 reveals the silence he encountered. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets." In desperation, Saul did something he himself had forbidden. He consulted a medium. He went in disguise to the witch of Endor and asked her to call up the prophet Samuel, who had died. The spirit that appeared delivered a devastating prophecy. Chapter 28 verse 19 records the words, "The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." The next day the battle began. Chapter 31 verses 1 and 2 describe the disaster. "Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua." Verse 3 continues, "The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically." Saul knew what the Philistines would do if they captured him alive. Verse 4 shows his desperate final moments. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it, so Saul took his own sword and fell on it. The armor-bearer, seeing Saul was dead, also fell on his sword and died with him. The Philistines' treatment of Saul's body was brutal and humiliating. Verses 8 through 10 describe what they did. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor, and they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and fastened his body to the wall of Beth-shan. The Philistines had won their greatest victory over Israel. The king was dead, his sons were dead, and the Israelite army had been routed. It appeared that Philistine domination was complete. David eventually became king, first over Judah and then over all Israel. The Philistines had tolerated David when he ruled only Judah, but when all the tribes united under him, they recognized the threat. 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 17 explains their response. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, they went up in full force to search for him, but David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Lazi, David inquired of the Lord, and verse 19 records God's answer. So David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go and attack the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hands?" The Lord answered him, "Go, for I will surely deliver the Philistines into your hands." David attacked and won decisively. Verse 20 describes the victory. So David went to Baal-perazim, and there he defeated them. He said, "As waters break out, the Lord has broken out against my enemies before me." So that place was called Baal-perazim. The Philistines tried again. Verses 22 and 23 continue the story. Once more the Philistines came up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, and he answered, "Do not go straight up, but circle around behind them and attack them in front of the poplar trees." And God gave David specific battle instructions in verse 24. "As soon as you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the poplar trees, move quickly, because that will mean the Lord has gone out in front of you to strike the Philistine army." David obeyed, and verse 25 records the result. So David did as the Lord commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines all the way from Gibeon to Gaza. These victories fundamentally changed the balance of power. David didn't just defeat the Philistines, he systematically broke their military strength. Chapter 8 verse 1 summarizes the result. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Ammah from the control of the Philistines. David reduced Philistia to vassal status. The 5 cities remained, but they now paid tribute to Israel and could no longer threaten Israelite territory. The people who had dominated Israel for generations were now dominated themselves. After David's conquests, the Philistines never regained their former power. When Solomon inherited his father's kingdom, Philistia remained subdued. The cities continued to exist, but they were no longer independent powers capable of challenging Israel. During the period of the divided kingdom, when Israel split into northern and southern kingdoms, the Philistines occasionally tried to reassert themselves. 2 Chronicles chapter 21 verse 16 mentions one such attempt. "The Lord aroused against Jehoram the hostility of the Philistines and of the Arabs who lived near the Cushites. King Uzziah of Judah fought against them and won victories." 2 Chronicles chapter 26 verse 6 records, "He went to war against the Philistines and broke down the walls of Gath, Jabneh, and Ashdod. He then rebuilt towns near Ashdod and elsewhere among the Philistines." But these were minor conflicts compared to the existential struggles of earlier centuries. The Philistines had become just another small power in the region, sometimes enemies of Israel, sometimes allies, always overshadowed by larger empires. The prophets of Israel pronounced judgments against Philistine cities, showing that tensions continued. Amos chapter 1 verse 6 declares, "This is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Gaza, even for 4, I will not relent. Because she took captive whole communities and sold them to Edom, Zephaniah chapter 2 verse 5 pronounced doom on the coastal inhabitants. Woe to you who live by the sea, you Kerethite people. The word of the Lord is against you, Canaan, land of the Philistines. He says, I will destroy you, and none will be left. The Philistines, who had once threatened to destroy Israel, now faced their own destruction, not primarily from Israel, but from the great empires that were rising in the east. The Assyrian Empire was like a storm rolling across the ancient world, and nothing could stand in its way. In the 8th century BC, the Assyrians began pushing westward toward the Mediterranean coast, and the Philistine cities stood directly in their path. Tiglath-Pileser III led the first major Assyrian campaigns into Philistine territory around 734 BC. The Philistine cities, which had maintained their independence for so long, suddenly faced an enemy far more powerful than Israel had ever been. The Assyrians didn't just want tribute, they wanted total control. One by one, the great Philistine cities fell under Assyrian domination. The prophet Isaiah witnessed these events and spoke God's words about them. In Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1, the Bible records, in the year that the supreme commander sent by Sargon, king of Assyria, came to Ashdod and attacked and captured it. This wasn't just a military defeat. The Assyrians had a brutal policy of relocating conquered peoples. They would take large portions of the population from their homeland and scatter them across the empire, replacing them with people from other conquered territories. This broke the spirit of rebellion and destroyed local identity. The city of Ashdod was devastated. Its people were deported, its walls torn down, and its independence ended. But Ashdod wasn't alone. The Assyrian king Sennacherib later campaigned through the entire region, and his records boast of conquering 46 fortified cities in Judah and the surrounding areas, including Philistine territories. Some Philistine cities actually grew under Assyrian rule, but only as servants of the empire. Ekron became a major center for producing olive oil, but it produced this oil for Assyrian profit, not Philistine independence. The city expanded. Industrial installations multiplied, but the Philistines who worked there did so as subjects of a foreign emperor. The glory days were over. The Philistines who had once challenged Israel now bowed to Assyrian overlords, paid crushing tribute, and provided soldiers for Assyrian armies. Their culture began to blend with other peoples the Assyrians had moved into their territories. The distinctive Philistine identity started to blur and fade. The Assyrian Empire didn't last forever. By the late 7th century BC, it began to crumble under attacks from the Babylonians and Medes. As Assyrian control weakened, some Philistine cities experienced a final moment of prosperity. Ekron, in particular, saw remarkable growth during this period. The city expanded to its largest size ever, with massive industrial zones dedicated to olive oil production. Archaeological excavations have uncovered over 100 olive oil presses in the city, an industrial operation on a scale rarely seen in the ancient world. The population of Ekron may have reached tens of thousands during this brief resurgence. The city's layout shows careful planning, with industrial quarters separated from residential areas. The Philistines were taking advantage of the power vacuum left by Assyrian decline to rebuild their economy and their cities. But this prosperity was built on shaky ground. The same forces that were destroying Assyria would soon turn their attention to smaller powers like the Philistine cities. The Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, were creating a new empire, and they had no intention of allowing independent states along the Mediterranean coast. The Philistines couldn't have known they were living through their civilization's final days. They built, they traded, they prospered, thinking perhaps that they had weathered the worst and would continue as they always had. The oil presses of Ekron worked constantly, producing wealth and giving hope that Philistine power might somehow return. But prophecy had already declared their fate. The words spoken by Jeremiah and other prophets centuries earlier were about to come true with devastating precision. In 604 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's Babylonian army swept through Philistine territory like a consuming fire. The prophet Jeremiah had warned this was coming. In Jeremiah chapter 47 verses 1 and 2, the word of the Lord came, "This is the word of the Lord that came to Jeremiah the prophet concerning the Philistines before Pharaoh attacked Gaza. This is what the Lord says. See how the waters are rising in the north. They will become an overflowing torrent. They will overflow the land and everything in it, the towns and those who live in them. The people will cry out, all who dwell in the land will wail." The first city to fall was Ashkelon. The Babylonian army completely destroyed it, killing most of its inhabitants and taking the rest captive. This wasn't a conquest for tribute, this was annihilation. Ashkelon, one of the 5 great Philistine cities that had stood for over 600 years, was wiped out in a matter of days. Jeremiah chapter 47 verse 5 speaks of this destruction. Gaza will shave her head in mourning, Ashkelon will be silenced. You remnant on the plain, how long will you cut yourselves? The other Philistine cities fell in subsequent campaigns. Ekron, with all its olive oil prosperity, was conquered and destroyed between 604 and 582 BC. Gaza, Ashdod and Gath all suffered the same fate. The Babylonians followed their own policy of deportation, taking skilled workers, craftsmen, and leaders back to Babylon as captives. The prophet Ezekiel, himself an exile in Babylon, pronounced God's judgment on the Philistines. In Ezekiel chapter 25 verses 15 and 16, the Lord declares, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah, therefore this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I will wipe out the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast." These weren't empty threats. The Babylonians carried them out with thorough efficiency. The 5-city system that had made the Philistines strong now meant there were 5 major targets to destroy. One by one, they fell. Unlike previous conquests where the cities had eventually recovered, this destruction was different. The Babylonians didn't just defeat the Philistines, they scattered them. Thousands were marched to Babylon, never to return. Others fled to Egypt or dispersed into surrounding territories. The concentrated Philistine population that had maintained its distinct identity for centuries was broken apart and scattered across the ancient Near East. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he inherited control of all Babylonian territories, including the former Philistine lands. The Persian Empire operated differently than previous empires, but the effect on Philistine identity was just as devastating. The Persians organized their vast empire into provinces called satrapies. The coastal region that had been Philistia became part of a larger administrative unit. Some of the old cities were rebuilt and repopulated, but not by Philistines alone. The Persians moved various peoples into the region, creating mixed populations. The distinctive Philistine culture that archaeologists can identify in earlier periods simply disappears from the archaeological record during the Persian era. The characteristic pottery styles vanish. The unique architectural features are gone. The material culture of the region becomes indistinguishable from other parts of the Persian province. The Philistines who remained in the region faced a choice: maintain a separate identity and remain marginalized, or assimilate into the broader population and gain opportunities under Persian rule. Most chose assimilation. They married people from other groups, adopted Aramaic as their language, since it was the administrative language of the Persian Empire, and gradually lost the cultural markers that had defined them. The name Philistine begins to fade from historical records during this period. When ancient writers mention the coastal cities, they describe them as Persian cities with mixed populations, not as Philistine strongholds. The ethnic and cultural identity that had survived conquest by Israel, subjugation by Assyria, and destruction by Babylon finally dissolved under the more subtle pressure of Persian imperial administration. Young Philistines growing up in this era would have had little connection to the warrior culture of their ancestors. They didn't speak the old language, didn't practice the old customs, didn't worship in the old ways. They were becoming something else, generic subjects of a vast empire, their unique heritage fading with each passing generation. Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire in 332 BC, bringing Greek culture and language to the entire region. The coastal cities that had once been Philistine became thoroughly Hellenized, adopting Greek as their primary language and Greek customs as their way of life. Gaza remained an important city, but now it was a Greek polis, not a Philistine stronghold. The people living there built Greek-style theaters, gymnasiums and temples. They worshipped Greek gods alongside or instead of the old deities. The few remaining cultural threads connecting them to the Philistines of old were severed completely. By this time, calling someone a Philistine would have been historically meaningless. There was no distinct Philistine people anymore, no Philistine language, no Philistine culture. The cities remained, but they were inhabited by Greeks, Phoenicians, Arabs, Jews, and various other peoples who had been mixed together by centuries of imperial policies. When the Romans conquered the region in 63 BC, they found a thoroughly Hellenized coast with no trace of the ancient Philistine civilization. The Romans continued using Greek as the administrative language and maintained the Hellenistic culture that Alexander had introduced. However, the Romans would inadvertently preserve the Philistine name in an unexpected way. After the Jewish revolt known as the Bar Kokhba Rebellion in 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian wanted to erase Jewish connections to the land. He renamed the entire province Syria Palestina, using the Latin form of Philistine to designate the region. This was deeply ironic. The Philistines, ancient enemies of the Jews, had been gone for over 600 years. Yet the Romans used their name to rename the Jewish homeland, creating a label that would persist through history. The land became known as Palestine, derived from Philistine, even though no actual Philistines remained to occupy it. For many centuries, almost everything known about the Philistines came from the Bible and a few references in other ancient texts. Then in the late 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began systematically excavating sites in the coastal plain of Israel, and the Philistines emerged from the ground. Major excavations at Ashkelon, Ekron, Ashdod, Gath, and Gaza uncovered the remains of Philistine civilization. Archaeologists found city walls, gates, houses, temples, workshops, and thousands of artifacts that revealed how the Philistines actually lived. The pottery discoveries were particularly significant. The distinctive Philistine ceramics, with their bird motifs and geometric patterns, provided clear evidence of Aegean origins. These weren't styles borrowed from neighbors. They were imports from the Philistines' homeland, maintained for generations after settlement. Temples dedicated to Philistine gods were discovered, with architectural features unlike anything else in Canaan. At Ekron, archaeologists found an inscription that actually named the city and mentioned its rulers, providing direct historical evidence that matched biblical accounts. Perhaps the most dramatic discovery came in 2016, when archaeologists at Ashkelon uncovered a Philistine cemetery, the first ever found. Over 200 burials revealed how the Philistines treated their dead, what goods they buried with them, and provided skeletal remains for scientific analysis. These discoveries transformed understanding of the Philistines from biblical villains into a real, complex civilization. The archaeological evidence showed they were sophisticated urban people with advanced technology, international trade connections, and a rich material culture. The discovery of the Philistine cemetery at Ashkelon allowed scientists to do something impossible before: extract and analyze ancient DNA from Philistine skeletons. The results confirmed what historians had suspected. The Philistines originally came from Europe, most likely from the Aegean region. The DNA from the earliest Philistine burials showed clear European ancestry, matching populations from Greece, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. This genetic signature proved the Philistines weren't native Canaanites, but immigrants who had crossed the Mediterranean Sea. But here's what's even more interesting. When scientists analyzed DNA from later Philistine burials, just a few centuries after the initial settlement, the European genetic signature had largely disappeared. The later Philistines showed genetic profiles very similar to other people living in the region. What does this mean? It means the Philistines intermarried extensively with surrounding populations. Within just a few generations, the distinct genetic heritage they brought from Europe was diluted and absorbed into the local gene pool. They became, genetically speaking, Levantine people like their neighbors. This genetic assimilation paralleled the cultural assimilation. While the first-generation Philistines maintained their homeland traditions fiercely, later generations gradually adopted local customs, languages, and practices. By the time the Babylonians destroyed the Philistine cities, the people living there were already a hybrid population, Philistine in name, but mixed in reality. After the Babylonian deportations and the centuries of imperial rule that followed, whatever remained of Philistine genetic heritage was completely absorbed into the diverse populations of the ancient Near East. No modern population can claim direct descent from the ancient Philistines as a distinct ethnic group. They simply vanished into the genetic and cultural melting pot of the region. Today, if you call someone a Philistine, you're not talking about ancient warriors from Gaza. You're calling them uncultured or ignorant, someone who doesn't appreciate art or intellectual pursuits. This usage of the word comes from 17th century German university students who used Philister as slang for townspeople they considered unsophisticated. The irony is thick. The real Philistines were actually quite sophisticated. They had advanced metallurgy, well-planned cities, international trade networks, and a complex urban culture. They were technological innovators, not backwards barbarians. Yet their name became an insult, meaning the opposite of what they actually were. The modern word Palestinian comes from the Roman name Palestina, which itself derives from Philistine. But there's no direct ethnic or cultural connection between ancient Philistines and modern Palestinians. The Palestinians are descended from various Arab, Canaanite, and other groups who have lived in the region over millennia, not from the Aegean Sea peoples who settled there over 3,000 years ago. This confusion sometimes leads to political misunderstandings. Some people try to draw direct lines between ancient Philistines and modern conflicts, but these connections are historically false. The ancient Philistines disappeared completely as a distinct people more than 2,000 years ago. The Philistine story is actually a powerful reminder of how civilizations rise and fall. Here was a people who seemed invincible, who dominated the region for centuries, who had the best technology and the strongest cities, yet they're completely gone. Not a single person on earth today speaks their language, practices their religion, or can claim pure Philistine ancestry. The prophets of Israel declared the Philistines would be destroyed and forgotten, and against all odds, that's exactly what happened. The civilization that once threatened to destroy God's chosen people was itself utterly destroyed. Their cities became archaeological sites, Their language became extinct, their culture vanished, their very name became a word meaning something they never were. The land they once ruled still bears a form of their name, but the people themselves are gone, absorbed into history and leaving behind only pottery shards, ruined walls, and ancient texts that remember them as enemies of Israel and objects of divine judgment. If this video opened your eyes to the incredible story of the Philistines and the accuracy of biblical prophecy, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear how God's promises always come true. There are so many more amazing biblical stories waiting for you on this channel. Stories that will strengthen your faith and reveal the power of God's word throughout history. Don't let this be the last biblical truth you discover today. Subscribe, share, and let's keep exploring